The heavy metal crank squeaked as it turned, pressing stewed tomatoes through that tiny perforated bowl, leaving every bitter seed behind. It was 1964, and the women who stood at those counters knew something food companies have spent 60 years trying to make you forget. The 1960s kitchen was not what most people picture when they imagine that era. It was not purely a scratch-cooking paradise, and it was not yet the fully processed world that would arrive in the 1980s. It was something more interesting than either of those things. Brands like Swanson TV dinners and Chunking frozen foods were landing in American freezers for the first time, and homemakers were doing something remarkable with them. They were applying decades of Depression-era stretching logic to these new convenience items, pulling them apart and rebuilding them with fresh aromatics, homemade stocks, and finishing techniques that made a frozen block taste like it came off a Sunday stove. The 1960s kitchen was a hybrid, and that hybrid was genuinely sophisticated. Here is the thing that nobody says out loud, but that becomes obvious the moment you look at the list we are going through today. Every single one of these tricks eliminates a product from a grocery store shelf. When your grandmother saved her vegetable trimmings for stock, the broth aisle lost a sale. When she dried stale bread for crumbs, the breadcrumb canister stayed on the shelf. When she used a food mill to process garden tomatoes, the jarred sauce company got nothing. These were not just clever habits. They were acts of total kitchen independence, and the food industry that exploded in the late 1970s and 1980s understood exactly what it needed to do. It needed to make those skills feel old-fashioned, burdensome, and not worth your time. Something interesting has been happening over the last several months. YouTube and TikTok have been flooded with videos about forgotten 1960s cooking tricks, and they are pulling in millions of views. Modern chefs and food scientists are sitting down in front of cameras and formally validating methods that were dismissed for 40 years as quaint and inefficient. The food mill is getting serious academic attention. The Roux is being taught again in home cooking circles. Stale bread repurposing has its own corner of the internet now. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and apparently a very large number of people have decided they want it back. You are not alone in that feeling, and you are not wrong to have it. There is a reason this particular moment feels urgent, and it is not just nostalgia. Grocery prices in 2026 are squeezing American families in a way that rhymes uncomfortably with 1968. Back then, a homemaker at the end of the month was not shopping for luxury. She was engineering meals from what she had, stretching proteins across multiple dishes, and hosting dinner parties on budgets that would make a modern host flinch. The techniques she used were not born from trend or hobby. They were born from necessity sharpened into skill, and every single one of those techniques transfers directly to a 2026 kitchen without modification. The budget dinner party is making a comeback because it has to, and the women who perfected it 60 years ago left behind everything we need. Trick number 1 is the hand-cranked food mill, and I want to spend real time on this one because it is the trick that opened my eyes to how much ground we have lost. The food mill is a simple tool. It has a bowl with tiny perforations in the bottom, a flat metal blade, and a hand crank on top. You load it with cooked tomatoes, cooked apples, cooked root vegetables, whatever you are processing, and you turn the crank. The blade presses the soft flesh down through the holes, while the skin, seeds, and fibrous bits stay behind in the bowl. What comes out the bottom is a perfectly smooth, perfectly clean puree. No electricity. No cleanup beyond a rinse. No jarred sauce needed. Long before electric food processors arrived in American kitchens, this was the tool that made Sunday gravy possible every single week. Now here is where the food mill stops being just a charming antique and becomes genuinely superior to what replaced it. When you put a cooked tomato into an electric blender, the high-speed blade does not separate the seed from the flesh. It pulverizes everything together, and tomato seeds contain compounds that release a sharp, bitter flavor when they are broken open and blended into the sauce. That bitterness gets distributed throughout every spoonful. The food mill never touches the seeds. It presses around them, leaving them whole and intact in the discard bowl, while the sweet tomato flesh passes cleanly through. The result is a sauce that is noticeably sweeter, cleaner, and more rounded in flavor. Modern chefs have been formally acknowledging this for the past year. Your grandmother knew it by instinct 60 years ago. Trick number 2 is one that sounds almost too simple to be worth mentioning until you actually try it, and then you will never go back. Slicing a soft layer cake, a log of fresh goat cheese, or a ball of homemade dough with a knife compresses the very thing you are trying to cut. The blade pushes down before it slices, and the crumb structure underneath collapses. What you get is a squashed, uneven cut with dragged edges. What 1960s homemakers used instead was a length of unflavored string, thread, or dental floss. You slide it under the item, cross the two ends over the top, and pull outward. The string slices cleanly through without any downward pressure at all. The layers stay level. The cheese holds its shape. The dough portions come out even. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works. The reason this works comes down to pressure direction. A knife blade, no matter how sharp, applies force vertically before the edge engages horizontally. On anything with a tender, airy structure, that vertical compression happens faster than the cut, and the damage is done before the slice is complete. A taut horizontal string applies zero vertical pressure. The entire cutting force is lateral, moving outward from the center of the item simultaneously from both sides. The crumb never compresses. The cheese never drags. The dough never distorts. This is not a gimmick. It is a physics solution to a real culinary problem, and it was standard practice in American home kitchens for decades before the serrated knife became the go-to answer. The serrated knife is better than a smooth blade, but it still applies downward pressure. The string does not. Trick number 3 is the vegetable scrap bag, and this one might be the most quietly powerful habit on this entire list. The practice is simple. You keep a zip-close bag or a lidded container in your freezer, and every time you trim vegetables, the trimmings go into the bag instead of the trash. Onion skins and root ends, carrot peels, celery leaves and the base of the stalk, leek tops, parsley stems, mushroom stems, corn cobs, the papery outer layers of garlic. None of these are garbage. Every one of them carries flavor compounds that dissolve beautifully into hot water. When the bag is full, you cover the contents with cold water, bring it to a simmer, and let it run for 45 minutes to an hour. What you strain off is a deeply flavored vegetable stock that costs you nothing beyond the water and the gas. Every single time a homemaker fills that scrap bag instead of the trash can, the broth aisle loses a sale. That is not an exaggeration. The boxed broth industry is enormous, and it is built entirely on the premise that you do not have time, space, or inclination to make your own. The marketing around packaged broths in the late 1970s and 1980s was specifically designed to make homemade stock feel like a project for someone with a professional kitchen and hours to spare. The reality is that making stock from scraps requires almost no active time. You fill a pot, you walk away, you come back an hour later. The 1960s homemaker knew this. She did not need a recipe card for it. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart, and every woman who knew it was a customer the broth companies never got to keep. Trick number 4 is the Parmesan rind, and this one has been getting a lot of attention from modern chefs lately, which is a little funny because it was never a secret. It was just something you did. When you finished a wedge of hard-aged cheese, you did not throw the rind away. The rind is too hard to eat, but it is absolutely full of concentrated flavor. You dropped it into whatever soup or broth was on the stove, a minestrone, a bean soup, a simple vegetable broth, and you let it simmer with everything else. Over the course of 30 or 40 minutes, the rind slowly softened and released a deep, savory, rounded flavor into the liquid that no bouillon cube has ever come close to replicating. When the soup was done, you fished out the rind and discarded it. The flavor stayed behind. The reason the Parmesan rind works so well comes down to glutamates. Aged hard cheeses like Parmesan are extraordinarily high in naturally occurring glutamates, which are the same compounds responsible for the savory, mouth-coating quality we now call umami. When the rind sits in hot liquid, those glutamates dissolve slowly into the broth, building a layered savoriness that takes the soup from thin and vegetable forward to something that tastes like it has been cooking all day with a ham bone in it. The 1960s homemaker did not know the word glutamate. She did not need to. She knew that the rind made the soup taste better, and that was enough. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, and in this case, what they stopped teaching was a piece of food chemistry that professional kitchens now pay significant attention to. Trick number 5 is stale bread repurposing, and I want to be specific about this because the method matters. Stale bread in a 1960s kitchen was never, under any circumstances, thrown away. The moment a loaf started to go firm and dry, it entered the second phase of its life. The standard approach was to cut or tear the bread into rough pieces, spread them on a sheet pan, and put them in a low oven, somewhere around 300 degrees, for 20 to 30 minutes until they were completely dry and hard all the way through. Once cool, those dried pieces were crushed, either in a cloth bag with a rolling pin or through a hand grinder, into fine shelf-stable breadcrumbs that could be stored in a jar on the counter for weeks. Those crumbs went into meatloaf, onto casseroles, into stuffings, and as a coating for pan-fried cutlets. Not one commercial canister needed. The specific method of drying at low heat, rather than high heat, matters more than it might seem. A high oven browns the bread before it dries it completely, which gives you toasted crumbs with a distinct flavor that limits how you can use them. A low oven dries the bread slowly and evenly, producing a neutral, pale crumb that takes on whatever seasoning you add to it. Those neutral crumbs could become Italian seasoned, or buttered and garlicky, or plain and fine for binding a meatloaf, depending entirely on what you were making that day. The versatility was the point. One base product, infinite applications, zero waste, zero store trips. The commercial breadcrumb industry sells you 3 or 4 versions of what this one technique produces on demand from something you were going to throw away. Trick number 6 is the day-old bread crouton, and it is worth separating from the breadcrumb trick because the technique and the purpose are different enough to deserve their own entry. Bread that had gone stale but was not yet dry enough for crumbs was cubed into roughly 3/4-inch pieces, tossed in whatever fat was available, usually butter or pan drippings, seasoned with salt and whatever dried herbs were on hand, and put into a hot oven or a hot skillet until they were golden and crisp on the outside with a slightly chewy center. Those croutons went into salads, onto soups, and into stuffings. They cost nothing. The store-bought seasoned crouton bag, with its list of preservatives and its uniform factory shape, replaced a technique that took 12 minutes and produced something genuinely better. There is a small story that lives inside the stale bread tricks, and it is worth pausing on for a moment. Picture the end of the month in a 1960s household. The grocery budget is essentially gone. The refrigerator is not empty, but it is not full either. There is a heel of bread that has gone hard, some odds and ends in the vegetable drawer, maybe an egg or two. The homemaker at that counter was not in crisis. She was in familiar territory. The stale bread became croutons for a soup made from the vegetable scraps. The egg went into a simple dressing. The meal was complete, dignified, and filling. None of it required a store trip. The skills to do this were so deeply embedded that they did not feel like skills at all. They felt like just knowing how to cook. That is exactly what we lost when those skills were marketed away. Trick number 7 is S.O.S, which stands for something impolite that I will leave to your imagination, and it is one of the most honest dishes American home cooking ever produced. The setup is a near-empty pantry at the end of a long month. What you have is a package of dried chipped beef, some butter, some flour, some milk and bread. What you make is a thick, salty, deeply savory white gravy poured over toast, and it feeds the family completely. The dish came out of military mess halls and Depression-era kitchens, and it traveled straight through the post-war years into 1960s homes where it served the same purpose it always had. It was not fancy, it was not trying to be. It was skilled use of almost nothing. And the fact that it tasted good was a testament to the technique behind it, not the ingredients. The Depression-era logic behind S.O.S. is worth understanding because it is the same logic that runs underneath almost every trick on this list. Dried beef was one of the cheapest preserved proteins available. It was intensely salty and intensely flavored, which meant a small amount went a long way. The white gravy, made from butter, flour, and milk, was a pure stretching vehicle. It took that small amount of protein and distributed it across a much larger volume of food. The toast underneath added starch, substance, and texture. Every component was doing multiple jobs. The beef provided protein and flavor. The gravy provided volume, calories, and richness. The toast provided the base that made it a complete meal. This was not poverty cooking in the pejorative sense. This was engineering, precise, practiced, and deeply intelligent. Trick number 8 is making thick white gravy from scratch, and I want to walk through the actual technique because it is one of those things that feels intimidating to modern cooks, but was second nature to anyone who learned to cook before 1975. The foundation is a roux. You melt butter in a pan over medium heat, then add an equal amount of flour and stir constantly for about 2 minutes until the raw flour smell cooks off and the mixture turns a pale golden color. Then you add your liquid, milk for white gravy, stock for brown gravy, slowly and steadily while whisking, and the roux absorbs it and thickens it into a smooth, glossy sauce. The ratio that most 1960s homemakers carried in their heads without ever writing it down was 2 tablespoons of butter, 2 tablespoons of flour, and 1 cup of liquid for a medium-thick gravy. Here is something that sounds almost too simple to matter, but it changes everything about how a finished pasta dish tastes from the very first bite. In the 1960s, homemakers salted their pasta water so heavily that it genuinely tasted like the sea. Not a pinch shaken over the rim of the pot, but a full, generous handful dropped in before the pasta ever touched the water. The starch inside each strand absorbs that seasoning as it cooks, carrying flavor all the way through to the center, not just coating the outside surface. The reason surface salting a finished plate of pasta never works the same way comes down to where the seasoning actually lives. When you salt after cooking, the salt sits on the exterior of the pasta strand and on the surface of the sauce. Your tongue tastes it immediately and intensely on contact, then it fades. But when the pasta itself was cooked in properly salted water, every bite, from center to edge, carries an even, rounded, deeply integrated flavor that no amount of finishing salt can replicate after the fact. Your grandmother knew this without ever reading a food science paper. Trick 21 is one of the most quietly brilliant habits in the 1960s kitchen, and it costs absolutely nothing extra because the ingredient was going to be poured down the drain anyway. Before homemakers drained their pasta, they scooped out a full cup of the cloudy, starchy cooking water and set it aside in a small bowl or a coffee mug on the counter. That milky liquid is loaded with dissolved starch, and when you add even a few tablespoons of it to your sauce while tossing the pasta, it emulsifies the fat and the liquid together into a glossy, clingy coating that holds to every strand without needing cream or a separate thickener. Think about what that 1 cup of pasta water actually replaces when you understand what it does. It replaces a splash of heavy cream to loosen a thick sauce. It replaces a cornstarch slurry to bind a thin one. It replaces the need to add more butter than you intended just to get the sauce to stop sliding off the noodles. Modern pasta recipes now celebrate this technique as a revelation, and food writers treat it like a professional chef secret discovered just recently. But in 1960s kitchens across America, it was simply what you did before you drained the pot. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart. Trick 22 is one that modern cooks have been told about in cookbooks and television programs for years, and yet it still gets skipped more often than not because it requires doing nothing And doing nothing in a busy kitchen feels like falling behind. Resting meat after cooking was standard practice in 1960s homes. A roast chicken came out of the oven and sat on the carving board, loosely covered with a clean kitchen towel for a full 10 to 15 minutes before anyone touched it with a knife. A pan-fried pork chop rested on a warm plate for 5 minutes. The patience was built into the rhythm of the meal. The science behind resting meat is straightforward, and 1960s homemakers understood it by feel long before food scientists put the explanation into words. When meat cooks, the heat drives moisture rapidly toward the center of the cut as the exterior tightens. If you slice into it immediately, that moisture rushes out onto the cutting board and is gone. But if you allow the meat to rest, the muscle fibers gradually relax, and the juices redistribute evenly throughout the entire cut. Every slice you carve after a proper rest is noticeably more moist and flavorful than anything you could cut from a pan straight off the heat. Trick 23 is so unglamorous that it almost feels embarrassing to include it alongside the others, and that is precisely why it belongs here. Before rubber grip cutting board mats existed, before the kitchen gadget industry invented specialty non-slip pads and suction cup feet for every surface, 1960s homemakers simply dampened a kitchen towel and laid it flat underneath their cutting board before they began any serious knife work. The board stayed perfectly still through an entire session of chopping onions, mincing garlic, and breaking down a whole chicken. No sliding, no chasing the board across the counter, no near misses. What strikes me most about the damp towel trick is not the simplicity of it, but the confidence it represents. A homemaker who knew this trick had already solved the problem before it became a problem. She was not reacting to a cutting board that slipped and sent a knife skittering across the counter. She had anticipated the physics of the situation and addressed it in 3 seconds before she picked up the knife. That kind of preemptive, practical thinking was the hallmark of the 1960s kitchen. It costs nothing. It requires nothing from a store, and it works every single time. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works. Trick 24 is one that bread bakers in particular will recognize immediately. Though it was used for any kind of dough work in the 1960s kitchen, from pie crust to dinner, rolls to the soft, sweet dough for cinnamon bread on Sunday mornings. Rather than dusting their hands repeatedly with flour when the dough began to stick, homemakers kept a small bowl of plain water on the counter beside the board and simply wet their fingertips lightly before working the dough. Wet hands release from sticky dough cleanly and quickly. Flour-dusted hands incorporate extra dry flour into the dough with every touch, slowly tightening the texture and making the finished product tougher than intended. The reason wet hands beat flour-dusted hands comes down to what you are actually adding to the dough with each contact. Every pinch of flour you dust onto sticky dough is a small addition of dry starch that the dough must absorb. Over the course of a 10-minute kneading session, those small pinches add up to a meaningful amount of extra flour that was never accounted for in the original recipe. The result is a dough that is stiffer than intended, a crumb that is tighter than it should be, and a finished loaf that is denser than the one your grandmother made from the same recipe. She used water on her hands. That was the difference. Trick 25 is one that anyone who bakes with brown sugar has encountered in the most frustrating way possible. You reach into the canister for a cup of soft brown sugar and pull out a solid brick that requires a hammer to break apart. In the 1960s, this problem was solved without a single specialty product. Homemakers stored their brown sugar in a ceramic canister with either a small piece of terracotta that had been soaked briefly in water or simply a heel of bread tucked in alongside the sugar. Both methods work by the same principle. They release a small, steady amount of moisture into the sealed container, keeping the sugar soft and scoopable indefinitely. The moisture exchange science behind the bread heel trick is elegant in its simplicity. Brown sugar hardens because the molasses coating each sugar crystal dries out and causes the crystals to fuse together into a solid mass. When you place a piece of bread inside the sealed container, the bread slowly releases its own moisture into the enclosed airspace. The sugar crystals absorb that ambient moisture back into their molasses coating and soften again. A terracotta disc soaked in water does the same thing over a longer period. Both methods are self-regulating. When the bread dries out completely, you simply replace it with a fresh piece. No purchase required, ever. Now that all 25 tricks are laid out, something worth pausing on is the fact that modern chefs and food scientists have spent the last several years formally validating the food mill as a superior tool for tomato sauce preparation. Publications that once dismissed hand-cranked equipment as quaint have now run side-by-side comparisons showing measurably lower bitterness in food mill-processed tomato sauces compared to blender-processed ones. The mechanism is the same one your grandmother understood without the laboratory confirmation. The gentle pressing action of the food mill separates flesh from seed without rupturing the seed coat, keeping bitter compounds out of the finished sauce entirely. When you look at all 25 tricks together as a single list rather than as individual tips, a pattern emerges that is impossible to ignore. Every single one of them eliminates a specific product from a grocery store shelf. The food mill eliminates jarred strained tomato sauce. The dental floss eliminates specialty cake slicing tools. The vegetable scrap bag eliminates boxed broth. The Parmesan rind eliminates powdered flavor enhancers. The stale bread eliminates store-bought breadcrumbs and crouton bags. The damp towel eliminates non-slip cutting board pads. The bread heel eliminates brown sugar softener discs sold in the baking aisle. Not one of these is a coincidence. The late 1970s and into the 1980s marked what food historians now recognize as a deliberate marketing erasure of manual kitchen skills. Food conglomerates had spent the post-war decades introducing convenience products, but by the mid-1970s they needed to do more than simply offer an alternative. They needed to make the original method feel like a burden. The language shifted in advertisements, in women's magazines, and in the new wave of cooking television. Words like labor-saving, time-consuming, old-fashioned, and outdated began appearing not as neutral descriptions but as judgments. The food mill was not just being replaced by a blender. It was being retired with prejudice. The specific language food companies used during this erasure period was carefully chosen to target the homemaker's sense of her own time and worth. Phrases like, "Why spend your Saturday making stock when this cube does it in seconds?" and "Your mother had to, but you do not have to," appeared in advertisements throughout the late 1970s. The framing was not about the quality of the result. It was about positioning scratch technique as a form of unnecessary suffering that modern women had been liberated from. What was actually happening was that a generation of women was being gently talked out of skills that represented genuine economic power and total kitchen independence. What was lost when homemakers were persuaded that their grandmothers' methods were inefficient goes beyond the individual techniques themselves. It was a way of thinking about the kitchen as a complete system where nothing was wasted. Everything had a second use, and the cook was in full command of every ingredient and every outcome. When you buy pre-strained tomato sauce, you are not just outsourcing the straining. You are outsourcing the decision about what goes into your food, in what quantities, with what additives, preserved by what method, and sold at what markup. The food mill is not just a tool. It is a declaration of sovereignty over your own kitchen. There is a misconception worth addressing directly, because it shapes how people remember 1960s cooking and whether they take these tricks seriously. The assumption is that 1960s kitchens were operating at one of two extremes, either entirely from scratch in the tradition of their Depression-era mothers or fully surrendered to the new wave of canned and frozen convenience foods. Neither is accurate. The reality was a masterful, deliberate blending of both. A homemaker might open a can of Chun King frozen vegetables and then finish the dish with homemade stock, fresh aromatics, and a knob of butter, producing something that tasted entirely homemade at a fraction of the cost and time. The hybrid model that 1960s homemakers practiced was actually more sophisticated than either the all-scratch purist or the all-convenience consumer, and it deserves to be recognized as such. It required a cook who understood the underlying principles of flavor, texture, and nutrition well enough to know which shortcuts were acceptable and which ones would compromise the final dish. She knew that boxed broth lacked the body of homemade stock, so she saved her scraps. She knew that frozen vegetables lost some texture in processing, so she finished them with fresh fat and aromatics. She was not choosing between tradition and modernity. She was using both as tools in service of feeding her family well. The thread that connects all of these tricks to each other runs deeper than the 1960s. It traces back through the post-war 1950s and all the way into the Depression-era logic of the 1930s and 1940s, when waste was not just impractical but morally unthinkable. Women who grew up during the Depression carried that orientation into their post-war kitchens and passed it to their daughters, who were the homemakers of the 1960s, saving the vegetable scraps, drying the stale bread, rendering the chicken fat. These were not trends or conscious choices. They were the inherited common sense of women who had learned from hard experience that the kitchen could provide everything you needed if you paid close enough attention to what you already had. The seasoning process on a cast iron pan was not a single event. It was a slow accumulation of trust built over months and years. Every time a homemaker fried bacon, seared a pork chop, or crisped a cornbread edge, she was laying down another invisible layer of polymerized fat onto that iron surface. Those layers bonded to the metal at the molecular level, building a cooking surface that grew more responsive and more forgiving with every single use. No factory coating, no chemical treatment, just heat, fat, and time doing exactly what they were designed to do. Before any 1960s homemaker minced a clove of garlic, she did something that took 2 seconds and changed everything about the flavor she would get from it. She laid the flat of her knife blade across the clove and pressed down firmly with the heel of her hand until she felt it give. That single crushing motion broke open the cell walls inside the garlic and triggered an enzymatic reaction that released allicin, the sulfur compound responsible for garlic's deep, sharp, complex flavor. A garlic clove that has been crushed first and then minced delivers a fundamentally different flavor than one that has simply been sliced or chopped directly without that initial pressure. There is a specific moment in the crushing of a garlic clove that you can actually smell. The instant the cell walls break, the kitchen shifts. That sharp, almost sweet, green-edged garlic scent that fills the air is allicin forming in real time. When you skip the crush and go straight to mincing, you are working with intact cells that release their compounds more slowly and less completely. The flavor you get is milder, flatter, and less layered. The 1960s homemaker who pressed that clove first was not following a written rule. She was following her nose, and her nose was right every single time. Blooming spices in warm fat was something 1960s homemakers did without ever calling it by that name. They simply knew from experience that if you dropped your paprika or your dried thyme directly into a hot pat of butter before adding anything else to the pan, the entire dish tasted deeper and more rounded than if you shook the same spices in at the end. What they were doing, without the vocabulary, was exploiting the fat-soluble nature of most flavor compounds in dried spices. Heat and fat together act as a solvent, pulling the aromatic oils out of the dried plant material and distributing them evenly through every bite of the finished dish. The fat-soluble science behind blooming spices explained something that puzzled home cooks for decades. 2 people can follow the exact same recipe, use the exact same spices from the exact same jar, and end up with dishes that taste noticeably different from each other. The cook who blooms her spices in butter first is releasing volatile aromatic compounds that would otherwise stay partially locked inside the dried plant material throughout the cooking process. The cook who adds spices at the end is seasoning the surface of the food without ever fully integrating the flavor into it. One technique builds flavor from the inside out. The other applies it from the outside in. Your grandmother knew the difference, even if she never had a word for it. The instruction to salt your pasta water until it tastes like the sea was not hyperbole. It was a precise culinary directive that 1960s homemakers understood in practical terms, even if they never heard it stated that poetically. When pasta cooks in heavily salted water, the starch granules absorbing that water carry sodium into the interior of every strand from the very beginning of the cooking process. The result is pasta that is seasoned throughout its entire structure, not just on its surface. No amount of salting at the table or tossing in a salty sauce can replicate what happens when the seasoning is built into the pasta itself during those first critical minutes in boiling water. Surface salting finished pasta is a compensation strategy, and it is a poor one. When you shake salt onto a plate of already cooked pasta, the sodium sits on the outside of each strand and dissolves unevenly in whatever moisture is present. Some bites taste sharp and salty, others taste flat. The seasoning never integrates because the pasta is already cooked and the starch structure has already set. What you are tasting is salt on top of food, rather than salt woven through food. The 1960s homemaker who salted her water generously every single time was not being wasteful or heavy-handed. She was doing the one step that made everything else she added to that pasta actually taste like it belonged there. Before she drained her pasta, a 1960s homemaker would dip a coffee mug into the pot and set it on the counter without thinking twice about it. That cloudy, starchy water was not waste. It was a finishing tool she reached for automatically when her sauce needed body, or when it looked too thick or too thin to coat the pasta properly. The dissolved starch in that reserved water acts as a natural emulsifier and thickener. When you splash a few tablespoons into a pan sauce and toss the pasta in it, the starch helps the fat and the water in the sauce bind together into a cohesive, glossy coating that clings to every strand. No cream, no cornstarch slurry, no separate thickening agent required. The pasta water trick is one of those techniques that feels almost too simple to be real until the first time you actually use it. The starch concentration in properly salted pasta water is high enough that even a small addition to a pan sauce creates a noticeable change in texture and cohesion within seconds of hitting the heat. Modern cooking shows have rediscovered this and present it as a professional restaurant secret. But it was never a secret in a 1960s kitchen. It was simply what you did before you drained the pot. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart. It was the kind of knowledge that lived in the hands and the eyes rather than on an index card in a recipe box. The rule about resting meat after cooking was so deeply embedded in 1960s kitchen practice that most homemakers would have been genuinely puzzled if you asked them why they did it. They did it because their mothers did it. And their mothers did it because they had learned from experience that a roast sliced the moment it came out of the oven, bled its juices all over the cutting board, and arrived at the table dry and disappointing. Resting works because the muscle fibers in cooked meat, which have contracted tightly from the heat, begin to relax as the temperature equalizes. As they relax, they reabsorb the moisture that was driven toward the center of the roast during cooking, redistributing it evenly throughout every slice. The specific resting times that 1960s homemakers used were not measured by a thermometer or a timer. They were measured by feel and by instinct built from years of cooking the same cuts in the same pans in the same kitchen. A woman who had roasted a 3-pound chicken every Sunday for 20 years knew exactly how long it needed to rest by pressing the back of her hand lightly against the breast and reading the heat radiating off it. She knew by the way the juices had stopped running in the pan. She knew by the smell shifting from sharp roasted fat to something deeper and more settled. That sensory literacy was a form of technical knowledge that no cookbook could fully capture and no convenience product could ever replace. Here is a trick that costs absolutely nothing and that every home cook before the rubber grip gadget era knew by heart. Before you set your cutting board down on the counter, you lay a damp kitchen towel flat underneath it. The moisture creates friction between the towel and the countertop and between the towel and the board, locking the entire surface in place as solidly as any suction cup base or rubberized mat sold today. A cutting board that slides even slightly while you are applying pressure to a knife is a genuine safety hazard. And 1960s homemakers managed this hazard with a tool they already had in their hands from the moment they started cooking. Simple, effective, and completely free. The damp towel under the cutting board is a perfect example of the category of knowledge that the late 1970s convenience marketing boom quietly erased. It was not replaced by a better technique. It was replaced by a product. The rubberized cutting board mat, the suction cup base, the non-slip grip sheet, each of these items was sold as a solution to a problem that homemakers had already solved for free using a dish towel they washed alongside everything else. The trick predates every rubber grip gadget ever manufactured and will outlast all of them. It disappeared from the general knowledge base not because it stopped working, but because there was no profit in teaching it. It disappeared from store shelves, but it still works. Anyone who has worked with a sticky yeast dough knows the frustration of watching it cling to every surface it touches, including your hands, in a way that flour dusting never quite solves. More flour changes the hydration ratio of the dough and can make the finished bread or roll noticeably denser and tougher than the recipe intended. The 1960s homemaker's answer to this was a small bowl of water sitting at the corner of her work surface. Wet hands release dough cleanly without adding any dry ingredient to the mixture. The water creates a thin barrier between the dough and the skin without altering the flour-to-water balance that the recipe was built around. The small bowl of water beside the bread dough is one of those tricks that feels almost embarrassingly simple once you know it, and yet it solves a problem that sends modern home bakers reaching for more flour every single time. Flour is the instinctive answer because it is dry, and it seems like it should counteract the stickiness of wet dough. But the stickiness of a properly hydrated dough is not a problem to be fixed. It is a sign that the gluten structure is developing correctly. Adding more flour to stop that stickiness is like adding more water to a fire to stop the steam. You are working against the chemistry instead of working with it. And the 1960s homemaker who kept that little bowl of water nearby had figured that out entirely on her own. Brown sugar hardens into a solid brick when the moisture it naturally contains evaporates out of the bag, and once it has gone hard, it is genuinely difficult to use. The 1960s homemaker's solution to this was not a specialty terracotta disc ordered from a catalog. It was the heel of a loaf of bread tucked into the sugar canister with the lid closed. The bread heel, which is slightly denser and moister than the interior slices, releases a small and steady amount of moisture into the enclosed airspace inside the canister. That moisture is absorbed by the brown sugar, keeping the molasses content soft and the crystals loose and workable. It cost nothing beyond what was already going stale on the breadboard. The moisture exchange science behind the bread heel trick is the same principle that the terracotta brown sugar savers sold in kitchen stores today are built on. A porous material that holds moisture releases it slowly into a sealed container, and the hygroscopic nature of brown sugar means it will absorb that ambient moisture and stay soft rather than crystallizing into a solid mass. The bread heel does this just as effectively as any fired clay disc because the science does not care what material is doing the releasing. What the food industry figured out was that the bread heel was free and the terracotta disc cost $4. There was no way to sell the bread heel, so the bread heel quietly disappeared from the general knowledge base and the specialty product took its place on the shelf. Modern chefs and food scientists have spent the last several years formally validating the hand-cranked food mill in professional and academic kitchens, and every time they do, they arrive at the same conclusion the 1960s homemaker already knew from experience. The food mill's gentle pressing action separates the sweet tomato flesh from the bitter seeds without ever breaking those seeds open. An electric blender, by contrast, operates by violent high-speed blade rotation that ruptures the seed walls and releases their bitter compounds directly into the puree. Chefs at serious restaurants are now specifying food mills for their tomato sauces in written kitchen protocols. The tool that was marketed out of existence in the 1980s is being rediscovered as the superior option it always was. Look at this list of 25 tricks and notice what every single one of them has in common. The food mill eliminates the need for jarred pasta sauce. The dental floss eliminates the need for a specialty cake slicer. The vegetable scrap bag eliminates the need for boxed broth. The Parmesan rind eliminates the need for powdered flavor enhancers. The bread heel eliminates the need for a terracotta sugar saver. The stale bread eliminates the need for store-bought breadcrumbs. Every trick on this list is a point of total kitchen independence, and every point of kitchen independence is a sale that never happens. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it every time you walk down a grocery store aisle. The erasure of these skills was not accidental, and it did not happen overnight. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, food conglomerates invested heavily in advertising campaigns built around a single core message. Your grandmother's way was hard, and our product makes it easy. The word they reached for most consistently was convenience, but the word doing the real work underneath it was shame. The implication in every television commercial and every magazine advertisement was that a woman who still made her own breadcrumbs or strained her own tomatoes was working harder than she needed to, and that working harder than you needed to was somehow a failure of intelligence or ambition. It was one of the most effective marketing strategies of the 20th century. The language shift was not accidental. By the late 1970s, food company advertising had quietly reframed every scratch technique as a burden. Saving vegetable scraps became messy. Using a food mill became time-consuming. Making a roux from scratch became complicated. These were not honest descriptions of difficulty. They were carefully chosen words designed to make a skilled homemaker feel that her grandmother's methods were something to escape, not something to protect. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart, and that is exactly what made it dangerous to sell against. When homemakers were told their grandmother's methods were inefficient, something more than a cooking technique disappeared. A whole framework of kitchen confidence went with it. Women who had once known instinctively how to stretch a chicken carcass into 3 separate meals began to feel uncertain in their own kitchens. They started reaching for the boxed version not because it tasted better, but because the marketing had successfully planted a seed of doubt about their own competence. That doubt was worth billions of dollars to the companies that cultivated it. There is a persistent misconception that the 1960s kitchen was one thing or the other, either a wholesome all-scratch paradise where everything was made by hand from the garden up, or a processed food wasteland of canned cream soups and frozen dinners. Neither picture is accurate. The real 1960s kitchen was a masterful blend of both worlds. A homemaker might open a can of Chun-King vegetables and then finish the dish with homemade stock she had simmered from last week's chicken bones. That blending was not a compromise. It was a skill. The hybrid model of the 1960s kitchen was actually more sophisticated than either extreme gives it credit for. It required a homemaker to understand both the limitations and the possibilities of every ingredient in front of her, whether it came from a garden row or a grocery shelf. She knew when a convenience shortcut was acceptable and when it would compromise the dish, She knew what a processed ingredient lacked and exactly which scratch technique would compensate for it. That is not laziness dressed up as cooking. That is genuine culinary intelligence operating under real constraints. The post-war practicality that shaped the 1960s kitchen did not appear out of nowhere. It was carried forward quietly from the Depression era by women who had learned, as children, that nothing edible was ever discarded without a reason. The mothers of the 1960s homemaker had stretched flour and fat back through years of genuine scarcity. That muscle memory did not vanish when prosperity arrived. It simply adapted. The same instinct that saved bacon drippings in a coffee can during the 1930s was still alive in the woman who saved her Parmesan rind in 1964 and dropped it into her minestrone without a second thought. It is worth saying plainly, the women who used these tricks were not hobbyists experimenting with quaint old methods for the pleasure of it. They were skilled managers of limited household resources operating under real financial pressure, real time pressure, and real social expectations all at once. They were expected to produce nourishing meals every single day, stretch a grocery budget that left almost no margin for error, and still present a table that looked welcoming. The kitchen tricks they used were professional-grade problem-solving. They just never received credit for it in those terms. When someone spends years quietly collecting vintage housewares, old recipe card boxes, and dog-eared copies of post-war homemaking magazines, they are not just accumulating objects. They are preserving a record of how real women thought about their kitchens, their budgets, and their families. Every handwritten note in the margin of a 1962 cookbook, every grease-stained index card tucked into a recipe box, carries the practical intelligence of a woman who was solving real problems in real time. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and the people who saved it are doing something genuinely important. So much of what these women knew was never written down at all. The exact feel of a roux when it has cooked just long enough, the sound a pan makes when the butter is the right temperature for pan frying, the way bread dough should pull back from the bowl when it has been kneaded enough. These were not secrets kept deliberately. They were simply knowledge that lived in the hands and the ears and the nose, passed from mother to daughter in the kitchen while something simmered on the stove. When that daily proximity ended, the knowledge did not move to a book. In many cases, it simply stopped. These 25 tricks are not being revisited simply because they feel warm and familiar. They are being revisited because modern chefs and food scientists are formally confirming what 1960s homemakers knew by instinct: that the food mill produces a genuinely superior tomato sauce, that blooming spices in fat releases significantly more flavor compound than adding them dry, that pasta water bound with starch is a more elegant sauce finish than added cream. The nostalgia is real, but it is not the reason these techniques hold up. They hold up because they are, by measurable culinary standards, correct. You do not need to adopt all 25 tricks at once. Pick one this week. If you have a block of Parmesan in your refrigerator right now, save the rind the next time you finish it. Drop it into your next pot of soup. That is the entire entry point. One small act that costs nothing, wastes nothing, and produces a depth of flavor that no boxed broth additive can replicate. The women who built these habits did not build them all at once either. They built them one meal at a time, one saved scrap at a time, until the whole system became as natural as breathing in their own kitchens. Of all 25 tricks on this list, the one I come back to every single week without exception is saving vegetable scraps in a freezer bag for homemade stock. Onion skins, carrot ends, celery leaves, the papery outer layers of garlic. Nothing goes into the compost until it has passed through that bag first. When the bag is full, it goes into a pot with cold water and comes out as something that no store-bought carton has ever matched in depth or color. It is the one trick that connects every other dish I make, and it costs exactly nothing. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, and this was at the heart of it. The kitchen remembers even when we forget. That phrase means something specific to me. It means that the techniques these women used left traces. In the seasoning of a cast iron pan that has been handed down through 3 generations, in the grease-stained index card that still smells faintly of onion, in the food mill sitting at the back of a thrift store shelf, waiting for someone who knows what it is. The knowledge was embedded in the objects and the habits long after the women who carried it were gone. Every time you use one of these tricks, you are not imitating the past. You are continuing it. Taken together, these 25 tricks are not a random collection of clever tips. They are a coherent philosophy. They represent a complete approach to the kitchen, built on the principle that skill is always more reliable than a product on a shelf. That a woman who knows how to make stock from scraps, slice a cake with floss, build a roux by feel, and braise a cheap cut into something beautiful is not dependent on any company for the quality of her table. That independence was real. It was practiced every day in millions of American kitchens. And the fact that it had to be marketed out of existence is the clearest possible evidence of how powerful it actually was. If your grandmother had a kitchen trick that nobody else seems to remember, I want to hear it. Leave it in the comments below. Tell me what she made, how she made it, and if you still make it yourself. This channel exists because of those stories, and every single one of them matters. If this video gave you something worth keeping, please subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. We are just getting started on what these women knew, and there is so much more left to uncover together. Thank you for spending this time in the kitchen with me. I will see you in the next one.